The lawyer for the family of Nolan Wells reveals new evidence in their investigation into how he died.
40 days after his body was found, the demand moved rooms. On the 13th of August, per WLOX, Congresswoman Lucy McBath stood at a press conference in Atlanta and said this family deserves answers and that they are demanding a full federal investigation. A member of Congress cannot open an investigation. She cannot direct the FBI. She cannot compel the Attorney General to do anything. What she can do is put a question in writing that has to be answered on the record. That is a smaller power than it sounds. It is also not nothing, and this video explains exactly where the line falls. That August press conference was a demand, but the finding at the center of this case, the one the family has been carrying since July, came from a different room entirely. According to ABC News and CNN, the family's independent autopsy was completed on July 22nd and 23rd. The examiners returned a cause and manner of death with 4 words: undetermined pending investigation. 4 words. That is the entire medical finding the family has. Now here is the part that matters: who produced it, and what those 4 words actually mean. The family did not go to the state, they went around it. Attorney Ben Crump, working for Christine Wansley, commissioned a private examination. That is a legal right. When a family doubts the official process or simply wants a second set of eyes, they can pay for their own autopsy. That examination was not done by the Jackson County coroner. It was not done by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner. It was done by independent pathologists hired by the family's legal team, and their conclusion was not a conclusion. Undetermined is not a finding of fact. It is a statement of limitation. It means the examiners looked at the body, looked at the available records, and could not establish a cause of death. Not yet. It does not say Nolan was murdered. It does not say he was not. It says, on the record, that the evidence available on July 22nd did not answer the question. And that is where the 2 autopsies split. Because the state has its own examination. The state closed its examination at the end of July, per WLBT. Its results have not been made public. They are going to a grand jury. So you have 2 documents. One is private, paid for by the family, and it says undetermined pending investigation. The other is official, completed by the state, and it is sealed. That gap between a private finding that cannot answer the question and an official finding that will not show its answer is the entire tension of this case. And it has been building for weeks. Because the public has not been given a single official finding. Not one. The family's autopsy is private property. The state's autopsy is going to a grand jury, which in Mississippi means it is shielded from public view while that body considers it. Now think about what that means for the timeline. The state closed its examination at the end of July, per WLBT. It is now mid-August. The grand jury has not issued anything public. Nobody has been taken to court over this death.com. That remains true as of this week. So the finding that exists is the family's, and the family's finding is a placeholder. Pending investigation is the medical examiner's way of saying the case is still open. The examiners could not determine what happened, so they are waiting for the investigation to finish. But here is the line that matters. That phrase does not say the investigation is failing. It does not say the state is hiding anything. A sealed grand jury file is a procedural step. It is not evidence of guilt. It is not evidence of conspiracy. It is the legal system working in a specific, quiet way. And the state has been clear about that. Officials made a request via Newsweek: wait for the work, do not preempt it. Their reason was practical, not defensive. Guesswork online slows the real work. Meanwhile, the family's lawyer is not waiting. Ben Crump has been on television, at press conferences, at the NABJ panel in Atlanta with Al Sharpton and Tiffany Cross. He has been making the case, in public, that the family deserves answers. But here is the uncomfortable truth about that 4-word finding. It is the only medical document the public has seen, and it answers nothing, which raises the question nobody has answered yet. If the state autopsy is complete, and it is going to a grand jury, what is the grand jury actually looking at? So what is a grand jury actually looking at? Let's put this in plain language, because the legal vocabulary is doing a lot of work here. Undetermined pending investigation is not a mystery. It is a standard medical finding. When an autopsy cannot establish a clear cause and manner of death, the examiner writes that phrase. It means the body told them something, but not everything, so they are waiting for the rest of the story to catch up. Think of it like a puzzle with missing pieces. The examiner can see some pieces. They just cannot see the whole picture yet, so they file it as undetermined, pending further investigation. Now, the state autopsy. According to WLBT, it was completed by July 31st. And here is the key detail. Its results have not been made public. They are going to a grand jury. A grand jury is not a trial, it is a closed-door review. In Mississippi, when a case goes to a grand jury, the evidence is presented to a group of citizens who decide whether there is enough to bring charges. Everything they see is secret. That is why the autopsy results are shielded. But here is what that means for you and me. We do not get to see the state's findings. We do not get to see what the medical examiner concluded. We only know that the examination is done, and the finding is now in a room where the public cannot follow. So we are left with two documents. One is private, paid for by the family, and it says undetermined pending investigation. The other is official, completed by the state, and it is sealed. And that gap is where the public conversation has been living for weeks. Now let's talk about what undetermined does not mean. It does not mean the investigation is failing. It does not mean someone is hiding something. It does not mean the examiners gave up. It means they could not answer the question yet. That is all. But the family's lawyer has been very clear that he does not accept that answer. Ben Crump has been on television, at press conferences, at the NABJ panel in Atlanta with Al Sharpton and Tiffany Cross. He has been saying, publicly, that the family deserves more. And the state has been saying something else. Officials made a request via Newsweek. Wait for the work. Do not preempt it. Their reason was practical, not defensive. Guesswork online slows the real work. That is a direct message to everyone watching this case online. So you have two sides speaking to the public. One side says we need answers now. The other side says wait for the process. And in the middle of all that, the actual investigation is still moving. According to Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter, his office has interviewed more than 60 witnesses. Federal land means federal help, and that is the Bureau's role on the data here. All three companions from that afternoon have been questioned. That last part matters. Per Live Now from Fox, the threat traffic aimed at those witnesses has drawn the Bureau in, and against officials working the case. So the people who were there are not just witnesses anymore. They are also targets of threats, and one friend's attorney has sent a cease and desist letter, according to WWL, The Griot, and ABC News. Here is what that tells us. The case is not static. It is not sitting in a file waiting for a grand jury to open it. There is an active federal component, focused on digital evidence. There is an active threat investigation, focused on witnesses and officials, and there is a state autopsy, completed and sealed, waiting for a grand jury that has not issued anything public. And no one has been charged. Per CNN, NPR, and NOLA.com, that remains true. So here is the question that the sealed document creates. If the state autopsy is complete, and it is going to a grand jury, what is the grand jury actually weighing? The state's finding is in the room. The family's finding is not. Undetermined pending investigation is a placeholder, not a conclusion. The grand jury has the official document. The public does not. Which means the only people who know what the state medical examiner concluded are the examiner's own office and the prosecutors. No grand jury has convened to read it yet, that is it. And that is the entire problem for the family, for the public, and for anyone trying to understand what happened on July 4th. Because a sealed finding is not an answer. It is a door that has been closed. And the only way it opens is if the grand jury decides to act. And that is where the next piece of this case comes into view. Because there is another document in this story, one that the state says is a fake, and it has been circulating online for weeks. Here is the limit of forensic power. It can tell you what happened to a body. It cannot tell you who was responsible. That gap is the entire story of this case. Look at what the family's independent autopsy actually said. Per ABC News and CNN, The cause and manner of death came back as undetermined pending investigation. That is not a finding, it is a placeholder. It means the examiners could not establish a cause. Not yet. The state autopsy is a different document. It was completed by July 31st, per WLOX. Its results have not been made public. They are going to a grand jury. So the public has two documents. One says, "We don't know yet." The other says, "Nothing at all." Here is what a grand jury actually does. It hears evidence. It decides whether there is probable cause to charge someone with a crime. It does not publish its reasoning. It does not explain its timeline. If the grand jury returns an indictment, that document becomes public. If it does not, the finding stays sealed. So the question is not whether the state autopsy is complete. It is complete. The question is what it concluded. And right now, only the grand jurors, the prosecutor, and the investigators know the answer to that. That is the wall the family is hitting. They have a lawyer, Ben Crump. They have a national platform. They have a sitting member of Congress demanding answers. But none of that opens the sealed document. The autopsy does not belong to them. It belongs to the state. Here is what the family's independent autopsy can and cannot do. It gave them a second opinion. It gave them a public document they could hold up and say, "Look at this." But it could not establish what happened. It ended with the word undetermined. That is a descriptor, per ABC News and CNN. It is not a conclusion. And this is where the limits of forensic science become the real story. An autopsy can tell you whether there was trauma. It can tell you whether there was disease. It can tell you whether substances were present, but it cannot tell you intent. It cannot tell you who was on the boat with Nolan Wells and what they did in the hours before he vanished. It cannot tell you why a 64-minute window exists between his last verified sighting and the time the boat left the island. That last number matters. CBS News obtained the state log. The island is astern by about 4:31 a.m. The last independently verified sighting of Nolan fell between 3:23 and 4:27 that afternoon, per the United Cajun Navy report via TMZ. That is a window. That is a gap. And no forensic document can close it. The autopsy cannot tell you what the three friends who were on the boat said in their interviews with the Jackson County Sheriff's Department. It cannot tell you whether their accounts matched. It cannot tell you why the FBI is investigating threats against those friends, per Live Now from Fox, instead of just investigating the death itself. It cannot tell you what is in the digital evidence the FBI is examining, because Horn Island sits on federal land, per Live Now's. So when you hear the state autopsy is complete, you need to be careful with what that means. It means the medical examiner's office has finished its examination. It does not mean the case is solved. It does not mean charges are coming. It means one document exists, and it is sitting in front of a grand jury. Now add the new public demand. Representative Lucy McBath stood at the NABJ press conference in Atlanta and said the family deserves answers. She demanded a full federal investigation, per WLOX. The Congressional Black Caucus sent a letter to Attorney General Todd Blanche and FBI Director Kash Patel, per ABC News. The question inside that letter is a separate federal investigation warranted, including a possible civil rights probe? Here is what that letter actually does. It asks a question. It requests a review. It gives the Attorney General and the FBI Director 7 days to respond. That is a deadline for a reply, not a deadline for an investigation. It does not open a new federal case. It does not unseal the autopsy. It asks whether one should exist. That is the limit of the demand. And that is the limit of the letter. And that is the limit of the forensic finding. Every piece of this case has a boundary. The independent autopsy ends with a placeholder. The state autopsy is sealed. The federal request is a question waiting on an answer. The 7 days have started. The response has not come, and that is where the next chapter of this case begins. So what does a Congresswoman's demand actually change about the other facts we already know? Start with the grand jury. The state closed its examination at the end of July, per WLBT. It is going to a grand jury. That was true before the letter. It is still true after the letter. A federal review request does not pause a state grand jury. It does not speed it up. It does not move the autopsy from Jackson County to Washington. Now the independent autopsy. Per ABC News and CNN, The family's examination returned a cause and manner of death of undetermined pending investigation. That finding was public before the NABJ panel. It remains public after. The letter does not change what those examiners concluded. It does not add a cause of death. It does not turn undetermined into something clearer. Here is what the letter does change. It changes the audience. Before August 13th, the findings in this case were being read by a state grand jury. That is a closed room. We do not know what the grand jury has seen. We do not know what questions its members are asking. We do not know when they will act. The letter does not open that room, but it puts a second audience in the room next door. The Attorney General and the FBI Director have now been asked a question in writing. That is a document. That is a record. That is a paper trail that exists independently of the state case. Per ABC News, the Congressional Black Caucus asked whether a separate federal investigation is warranted, including a possible civil rights probe. That question is now on file. And that changes the timeline. Not the investigative timeline, the public timeline. The state case moves at the pace of a grand jury. The federal question moves at the pace of a 7-day response window. Those are two different clocks, and we are watching both. Now add the witnesses into this. Per the Jackson County Sheriff's Department WLOX, more than 60 witnesses have been interviewed. The 3 friends on the boat have been interviewed. Per WWL and the GRIO, those friends have reported death threats and online harassment. One friend's attorney sent a cease and desist letter. Per Live Now from Fox, the threat traffic aimed at those witnesses has drawn the Bureau in. Here is the hard part. A federal civil rights investigation and a federal threats investigation are different things. The FBI is already looking at the threats. That is active. That is happening. The letter asks whether a civil rights probe is warranted. That is not active. That is a question. One is in motion. One is pending. Do not confuse them. They involve some of the same people. They do not involve the same legal question. And here is what the letter does not do. It does not name a suspect. Per CNN, NPR, and NOLA.com, no one has been charged. That remains true. It does not turn witnesses into targets. The FBI is investigating threats against them, not threats from them. That distinction matters. It matters to the young men who were on that boat. It matters to their families, and it matters to anyone watching this case. Officials made a request via Newsweek. Wait for the work. Do not preempt it. That warning was issued before the letter. It still stands after. So here is the honest picture. The letter is a moment. It is a public moment. It is a political moment. It is not a legal turning point. The state autopsy still sits with the grand jury. The independent autopsy still says undetermined. The digital evidence is still being examined by the FBI because Horn Island is on federal land, per WLOX. The threats investigation is still running. The 64-minute window still has no explanation. What changed is the pressure. A sitting Congresswoman stood at a podium in Atlanta and said the family deserves answers. That was recorded. That was broadcast. That was a fact in the public record before the letter was even sent. And now the 7 days are running. Representative McBath's own history explains why she is here. Per PBS NewsHour, her son Jordan Davis was killed in 2012. She entered politics as a gun violence prevention advocate. That is on the record. That is why she speaks with a particular weight on this subject. It is not evidence about Nolan's case. It is context about hers. The 7 days will end. The response will come. And when it does, we will know whether the federal question moves forward or stops where it stands. But there is one thing that will not wait for that response. One piece of this case is still moving on its own clock, and it is the piece that could change everything we think we know. The 7 days are a clock the letter's authors chose. There is nothing in federal law that says the Attorney General must answer in a week. Per ABC News, the Congressional Black Caucus gave Todd, Blanche, and Kash Patel 7 days. That is a request with a deadline attached. It is not a statute. It is not a court order. But watch what happens when that deadline passes. The letter does not disappear. It becomes a document that reporters can ask about. It becomes a question that follows the Attorney General to the next hearing. It becomes a fact that the family's lawyers can point to and say, "We asked, and here is what happened next." That is the real machinery here, not the legal process. the pressure process. And while the days count down, the state case moves on its own track. The autopsy completed by July 31st, per for ZULBT, is with a grand jury. That is a specific thing. A grand jury is not a trial, it is a group of citizens who hear evidence and decide whether there is enough to charge someone. Nobody has been taken to court over this death.com. The grand jury has not announced anything. It may announce something, it may not. Its work is secret until it is not. Here is what that means for you. The next public moment in this case might not come from Washington. It might come from a grand jury room in Jackson County, Mississippi. It might come as a name. It might come as a decision to stop. You will not see that coming until it arrives. Meanwhile, the threats investigation continues. The FBI is looking at threats against the people who were with Nolan in his final hours, per Live Now from Fox. That is not a small thing. Those young men have reported death threats and online harassment, per WWL, The Grio, and ABC News. One friend's attorney has sent a cease and desist letter. That letter is a legal object. It tells someone to stop. It is not an admission. It is not an accusation. It is a warning shot in a fight that should not exist. The friends have been interviewed, per Sheriff John Ledbetter. More than 60 witnesses have been interviewed, per the sheriff's office. That is a lot of conversations. That is a lot of statements. Somewhere in those statements, there may be a detail that matters. There may not be. The sheriff has not said what they contain. CBS News obtained the state log. The island is astern by about 4:31. That is a fixed point. The last verified sighting fell between 3:23 and 4:27, per the United Cajun Navy report. The boat left at 4:31. Those numbers sit next to each other in the public record. No official source has explained the gap. Officials made a request via Newsweek. Wait for the work. Do not preempt it. That request has not been withdrawn. The fraudulent toxicology report, flagged by Commissioner Sean Tyndall, per WLBT, is still out there, still circulating, still being treated as real by people who have not checked. So this is where the case stands. The federal question is pending. The state process is moving. The threats investigation is active, and the family is waiting. Christine Wansley sat on that panel in Atlanta. Per WLOX, she was there with her husband, with Ben Crump, with Al Sharpton. She listened to a sitting congresswoman say her son's name. She heard the words, "This family deserves answers." She has not gotten them. Not from the state autopsy, which is sealed in a grand jury. Not from the independent autopsy, which returned undetermined. Not from the FBI, which has not announced a finding. Not from the 7-day clock, which has not yet run out. She is the reason this case is still being followed. She is the reason the letter exists. She is the reason 60 witnesses have been interviewed. She is the reason you are watching this video. And she is still waiting. The next thing that happens will happen on someone else's schedule. The grand jury, the FBI, the Attorney General's office. Any one of them could move. Any one of them could stay silent. But there is a clock that is not political, and it is not the 7-day one. A sealed examination is going to a closed room on a schedule nobody outside that process controls. Whatever Washington does or does not answer, that is still the document this case turns on.